How many of you have ever been to a zoo? You've actually been to a zoo. Is there anybody who has never been to a zoo before? Mac, was your hand up or down? So you've been to a zoo, and we're not talking about your house, right? Okay, all right, just checking. Okay. As I grew up, my mom and dad live about 35 to 40 minutes from downtown Chicago, and so most every year at some point we would go visit the Lincoln Park Zoo. Because it was the free zoo. The Brookfield Zoo cost money, so we never went to that one. But we would go to the Lincoln Park Zoo, and my favorite parts of the zoo, I always loved going to that underwater area where you could watch the polar bears swim, or the creepy reptile house, because you knew the snakes and the lizards and all those creepy things were in there. And then the monkey house, I always knew it was going to smell when I went to the monkey house, but it was fun to watch those monkeys swinging around. And then I think my favorite animal is the penguin. I don't really know why, other than the fact that they walk so funny, and they always dive, and I feel so bad for penguins when they dive because they don't have any hands to put out in front of them. They just dive and land right on their chest and go sliding around. But I always loved, these were my favorites. But the one place that I always looked forward to going to was the large cat exhibit, because I wanted to be present when a lion roared. Like, I just thought that would be so cool, because you see it on National Geographic all the time, the big lion with his mane, and he shakes it, and he lets out a roar. And there was only one time in my life have I ever been present when a lion roared. And it was always disappointing to me, but, as I got older, I kind of realized, lions are just big cats. And cats, they sleep all the time. And cats don't really care what you want them to do. They're just going to do whatever they want to do, unlike dogs, which I love dogs, because dogs, they emote. Like, you can really tell how they feel. Have you ever seen the movie Up, where the dogs wear the collars that actually tell you what they're saying and thinking? My favorite is Doug, hello, I just met you. I don't even know you, but I love you, master. And then he's always the squirrel, that thing. But, it's like a dog, when you walk out of the room and then you walk back in, it's just like, where were you for the last 5 seconds? Let me lick you to show you how much I missed you when you were in the other room. A cat, on the other hand, a cat just lays there and looks at you. And basically, it's thinking, feed me, peasant. It's the only reason I even keep you around. That's what's going on through a cat's mind. But I love going to see the lions, because I just wanted to hear a roar. And there was one time at Lincoln Park Zoo, and I don't know, I haven't been there in a long time, so it may be very different now, but you had to stand behind a rail. There was about 10 feet of land in front of you, then a huge ditch, and then that was the cat exhibit. And so there was this big ditch separating, and there was one time that I walked up, and there was a large group of people who had gathered, and one of the male lions had walked right out to the edge of the ditch. You're kind of wondering, is he going to be able to scale that? Because it is one hop, and then he is going to feast. It's just what you're thinking. It was so cool, right? So just take that one moment where we're all gathered around, and there's a lion right in front of us. Just take this for instance. If I were to turn to somebody next to me and find out that he is a worker in the zoo, and he has a great knowledge of the lions, and I said, hey, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to jump the rail. I'm going to push that tree down. I'm going to run across the tree, and I'm going to jump into the lion's thing, and I'm going to go play with the lions. Now, if he were to grab me and say, you're such an idiot. You don't want to do that, because I'm going to tell you exactly what would happen if you do that. As soon as you step foot into the lion's lair, that lion is going to roar loudly, first to scare you, but primarily to gather the other lions who are then going to surround you. And without warning, one of them is going to jump on your back and knock you down. And your instinct is going to be to ball up. And so one of the lions is going to swipe a claw across your back, and he's going to draw blood. And that's going to make you cry out in pain. And all you're going to do is expose your neck so another lion can clamp down with vice-like grips and keep you from breathing. And while you're laying there trying to catch your breath, the other lions will begin gashing into your stomach and they will start eating you. Thank you, Jamie. Sorry about that. Now, let's just assume that's exactly how the conversation went. And I still jumped the fence, pushed the tree over, ran into the lion's den, and exactly what this zookeeper said would happen, happened. Let me ask you, would your reaction be to turn to the zookeeper and say, I cannot believe how mean you are? You told him all these horrible, horrific things that would happen. How could you say such stuff? You wouldn't say that to the zookeeper. You would look at me or my corpse that was, sorry, Jamie, that was being chewed out. You would look at my corpse and you say, this guy was such a dummy. He was warned about what would happen, and yet he did not stay in the safety that was given to him. He walked right to his death. Right? That would be your reaction. You wouldn't turn at the man who gave the warning and say, how cruel. You would turn at the one who was given the warning and ignored it and said, how dumb. Okay, keep that in mind as we approach Deuteronomy chapter number 28 today. Because in Deuteronomy 28, we are going to read graphic warnings of what would happen if Israel turns from following Yahweh in the promised land. And I know, because this is a normal reaction of Christians, as they are going to turn and look at God and say, I can't believe you would say stuff like this. And we completely ignore the fact that this was being told to them before they ever stepped a foot into the promised land. It was a warning of what would happen if they ever did. So keep that in mind as we read Deuteronomy chapter 28. A couple of weeks ago, we were here in Deuteronomy 27. If you remember, we talked about two mountains, the Mount of Ebal and the Mount of Gerizim, Ebal being the Mount of cursing, Gerizim being the Mount of blessing. And we looked at the difference, and this is kind of a continuation. We're going to see blessings and cursings in Deuteronomy 28. Look at verse number 1, if you would. Begins with this: if you fully obey Yahweh your God and carefully follow all his commands I give you today, Yahweh your God will set you high above all the nations on earth. I just need you to take that thought and put it in the very back of your mind for weeks to come. He's telling Israel that they will be different than every nation on the earth. Verse number 2, all these blessings will come on you and accompany you if you obey Yahweh your God. Now we're going to begin in verse number 3, and I need you just to follow the vocabulary. The vocabulary that is used is very important. Verse 3, you will be blessed in the city and in the country. The fruit of your womb will be blessed, and the crops of your land, and the young of your livestock, the calves of your herds, and the lambs of your flocks. Your basket and your kneading trough will be blessed. You will be blessed when you come in and blessed when you go out. And now, from there to the verse 14 is just filled with amazing blessings of what will happen if what? If they do what verse 1 says, which is, if you obey fully and carefully follow Yahweh. 14 verses of amazing blessings that will come to people who do. But then skip to verse 15 with me, if you would. However, we're going to see the opposite side. If you do not obey Yahweh your God and do not carefully follow all his commands and decrees I am giving you today, all these curses will come on you and overtake you. Notice the vocabulary. You will be cursed in the city and cursed in the country. Your basket and your kneading trough will be cursed. The fruit of your womb will be cursed. The crops of your land, the calves of your herds, and the lambs of your flocks. You'll be cursed when you come in and cursed when you go out. And from there to the very end of the chapter, which has 69 verses, it is one long list of judgments. But did you see how these couple of verses that we just read were the literal undoing of the first verses that we began with? Blessed, and then the exact opposite of cursed or judged if you don't. And then it goes on, and boy, it's some really rough stuff. We're not going to read through this whole chapter. I'm just going to show you some, I would use the word highlights, but they're really lowlights. In verses 27 through 29, if you have a Bible open, you can at least glance. Israel is told they're going to suffer the same plagues as Egypt, where they just left. God's people will face the same plagues as God's enemies. In verses 30 through 32, the men of the land will watch their wives be taken and raped, and their children be stolen from them. In verse 36, they're told another king who is not amongst yourselves will be ruling over you, meaning they're going to fall to another nation one day. And we mentioned this last week. You will become slaves to foreigners, people who from the outside are going to come into the promised land, and you will become their slaves. And then one day your cities are going to be plundered and the walls of your cities will be knocked down. You got to think of Jerusalem, right? That's what Ezra and Nehemiah are all about, the rebuilding of the walls that were knocked down. In verses 53 through 57, they are so oppressed by these other nations that they resort to cannibalism, eating their own family members for food. And from verses 64 through the end of the chapter, they're told that they will be taken from this land of the 12 tribes together, and they will be scattered across all the nations. And the words, you will never find rest. Now again, before we start turning and saying, like, how could God do all of this? What he is saying is this is what will happen. Not this is what I'm going to do to you. He's giving them a choice. And just in case everything that they had heard from Moses didn't shake them up, I want to draw your attention to verse number 68. Because what Moses says in verse 68 is absolutely startling to any student of the Bible. He says, Yahweh will send you back in ships to Egypt. On a journey I said you should never make again. There in Egypt, you will offer yourselves for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but no one will buy you. You got to take the picture. They had just escaped Egypt where they were slaves in bondage, and Yahweh delivered them. He redeemed them. He brought them across the Red Sea on dry ground. Now he's saying, if you turn from me, your life will be so bad that you will cross a ship to get back across the Red Sea, and you will go to Egypt, and you will ask them, please put us back in bondage again, just so we can have something. And people are going to look at you and say, no, you're not even worth it. The only way I could even begin to think how to express this to us today would be like picturing someone who had escaped from a Nazi concentration camp. And you could see the ribs, you could see the disease that was on them, and they got out. And yet they are back at the door of the concentration camp saying, let me in, let me in. No one would ever ask to go back to those types of atrocities. And yet, this is exactly what Moses, through the Spirit of God, is saying to these people of Israel. If you don't follow Yahweh, this is your end. And that just leads us it should just lead us to this question. If Israel knew the consequences of turning from God, why would they ever choose to walk away? Like, no one in their right mind would ever purposely choose to suffer. I mean, if the clear choices were, if you obey me, you will receive blessings, but if you follow your own way, you will be judged. And these are the judgments, including cannibalism. Why? why would they ever turn? And I believe Moses gives us a very clear answer right in the middle of all those verses of curses and judgments. Look with me at verse number 45, would you? Verse number 45 of Deuteronomy 28. Moses says this, all these curses will come on you. They will pursue you and overtake you until you are destroyed because you did not obey Yahweh your God and observe the commands and decrees he gave you. They will be a sign and a wonder to you and your descendants forever. And now notice verse 47. Because you did not serve Yahweh your God joyfully and gladly in the time of prosperity. You did not serve Yahweh your God joyfully and gladly when he blessed you so much. Actually, the ESV reads, because of the abundance of things. Which means what we are looking at is that a group of people received so many blessings from God, they had no idea how to handle the blessings. It's as if they thought, I deserve them. It's as if they thought, these are mine. I can do what I want to with them. And it's as if the blessings of God became more important than the God of the blessings. Right? We got to remember, all of these, everything we would read in Deuteronomy 28, Moses is saying before they get there, and here's what he is saying, if you follow Yahweh, he will bless you abundantly. You will have no need of anything. And it's like right there, he's trying to get their attention. And in that moment is when you need to remember you still need your God. Because if you don't, all of these blessings will steal your affection from God and will turn you to other gods. You notice he didn't say that they stopped serving Yahweh. Look, it says, you did not serve Yahweh your God joyfully. He didn't say that they had lost their joy. I think it's very clear what Moses was saying is that you may still have been going through the motions of serving God, but your joy was now directed from someone to something. You no longer loved God, you just loved his stuff. I read that, and as I was studying through this, I thought, how closely does this align with the lives of so many believers today? We have allowed the incredible blessings of God, things wonderful like our families, like our careers, like our salaries, have become the very barrier to us serving God with joy. I would assume that most everybody in here could share of a believer you knew at one time. When they came to church, they were smiling. They were so happy, like the joy of the Lord was all over them. But today, maybe they still come to a church service, but they have lost their joy. Or maybe they have completely abandoned the fellowship of God's people to go pursue their joy in other areas of life. But here's what I'm absolutely convinced of. Sorry, totally skipped it. Here's what I'm convinced of. If believers passionately pursued God, there would never be a lack of joyful servants to accomplish the Great Commission work. If every single person in here had a passionate pursuit of Jesus Christ, there would never be a lack of people who with joy would say, I want to serve Jesus in that way. A church that would be filled with joy-filled servants would never have to stand in front and say, we need some kids workers. You know why? Because people would be lining up to say, God has been so good to me. I want these little kids that fill these hallways on Sunday mornings, I want them to know how good Jesus is. A church that had joy-filled servants would never have to schedule greeters to stand at a door. And you know why? Because we would all be greeters. Like, we would not pass somebody in the hallway without saying, I'm so glad you're here. Isn't Jesus good? I'm so glad that you're here to worship with us. Can you not wait to go into that sanctuary where we are going to, with one voice, raise our song of praise to our King? This is going to be exciting, isn't it? And we'll have to endure Brian's jokes and his pretty poor preaching. But man, it's going to be awesome to be together. A church with joy-filled servants would have adults who recognize the value of having teenagers with hearts on fire for God and would be begging for the chance to pour into the lives of young people. A church with joy-filled servants would not be waiting for the pastor or the staff to organize Bible studies and small groups and community service projects. It would be individual believers pursuing Jesus who are moved by the Holy Spirit, and they follow with joyful obedience wherever He leads. I drove by the church this week. I think it was Friday afternoon. And the lawnmower was out front, and I don't know who was there because it was empty. But I drove by and I thought, thank you, Lord, that you put on someone's heart that one way they could serve this body is by cutting the grass. Thank you. I saw Liz Cox in the coffee shop on Friday morning, and she was telling me that she was here coming to meet Lindsay, and they were going to be cleaning the church. And I just, as they left, I thought, Lord, thank you so much for putting it on the heart of somebody to say one of the ways we could serve our church family is just by making sure that the hallways are clean and that everything is looking nice and good when the people of God come together. I heard of some ladies that got together for a Bible study in someone's home this week. I'm like, praise the Lord for that. I can't wait to see what's going to happen in youth group tonight. Our kids are being taught by a team of servants right now, and don't you want them to be joy-filled? Like, instead of saying, like, all right, this was my week, and I have to be here because it's my turn to tell you about how good God is, so sit there and listen to me while I tell you how good Jesus is. Like, no, you want people whose hearts are overflowing with how good God has been to me this week. And let me tell you about Jesus and how much He loves you. I know there were men in our church who were connecting with one another in discipleship this week. That's being a church filled with joy-filled servants. It looks like the ministry of Embrace Grace, which was not birthed from this church. It was laid on the heart of one lady in our church who was simply following the Spirit of God and said, if that's what you want, Lord, that's what I'll do. And she connects with another lady, and the plan comes together. It's presented to the church, and you as a church family responded so beautifully to be able to see this new ministry coming for single moms and how we can love and show them the goodness of Jesus. We need to be a church filled with joy-filled servants, not so that things run well on Sunday, so that the Great Commission work of Jesus is accomplished. You may or may not be familiar with this, but a normal statistic that is shared is that 20% of the people in the church care for 80% of the work of the church. And as I was studying that, and this is a statistic that has been true for years and years. The majority of people who come to church sit. And it's a smaller group that serves. And I was trying to think through this week as I was putting this message together, and I just began to ask myself some questions. I just want to share them with you. Could it be that churches are filled with tired and weary workers today because the large percentage of believers have prioritized the gifts over the giver? Could it be that we have lost our joy in service because we have lost sight of who we are serving? Like ultimately, we're not serving people. Like ultimately, we are serving our King, the King who served us. Could it be that most of us show up on Sunday needing to be filled rather than coming full, ready to be poured out? Could it be that our lives are filled with anxiety and depression and crisis because we have wrestled control away from the grip of the one who actually holds the world in his hands? Could it be that our marriages suffer because we are looking to our spouses to give us what only God can give? Ma'am, your husband is never going to listen to you the way that you need to be listened to. He'll always be distracted. Jesus never will be. And sir, your wife is never going to give you the craving that the attention that you crave. She's never going to fill that. But Jesus will. Could it be that the children who grow up in the church are walking away from the faith at an alarming rate? They say upwards of 80% of the kids who grow up in the church abandon the church after high school. Could it be that's happening because we cater to their wants and needs and we live our lives around their schedules and events and care for their feelings and their desires rather than teaching them what it looks like to surrender their all to King Jesus? I mean, all these questions that I ask, I'm like, so what's the answer? And I was really surprised by the answer. You're probably going to be really surprised by the answer too, because you're in church. And so what's the answer to everything? Jesus, right? Remember what we read in Deuteronomy? You will lose your joy because you have so much. Let me just show you what the Bible tells us about our Savior. In Hebrews chapter number 12, verse number 2. We read this, he says, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith, for the joy. Remember, they lost their joy. But Jesus, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame. And then he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. You understand the joy that was set before him means while the Israelites were getting everything, Jesus was losing everything. He was going to have his freedom taken from him, his reputation taken from him, his clothing would be stripped, his dignity would be stripped. They would mock him with a crown of thorns and a royal robe and a censer. They would take everything from him, and yet we read that Jesus held his joy. He knew what awaited him. And yet we would read this about Jesus in John chapter number 15. He tells his disciples this just hours before his death. If you keep my commands, remember Jesus is God. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. Okay, we can't forget this comparison. Israel was told, follow the commands of God and you will be blessed. You will remain in the blessings, which to them was the land. And Jesus says, I have kept all my Father's commands. And yet we know what was about to come to him. It was not the blessings. It was the very cursings that were going to come upon Jesus. And yet he said, but I am going to remain in my Father's love. Meaning ultimately it wasn't about the things. Jesus didn't need things to remain where God wanted him, while Israel was receiving things that would eventually cost them. And then he says in verse 11, I have told you this so that my joy, the joy that says I will do what my Father asks me to do, even as everything is stripped away from me, that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. Another word for complete is full. So you would be full of joy, so you would be joyful as you keep my Father's commands, which is exactly what Moses said would be the downfall of Israel. They would not serve God with joy. Israel lost their joy in serving God despite being given everything. Jesus held his joy in serving God despite costing him everything. So what's the takeaway? So what do we take home today? The takeaway is we gotta fight to keep our joy. It is a fight to keep our joy. And I want to tell you how. One way to do that is to preach the gospel to yourself daily, because we must begin to value the gospel over gold. Right? The gospel is good news. Every day, preach the good news to your heart and remembering what Jesus has done for you. The Son of God left the glories of heaven to walk this earth so he could take the curse for me, so that the Son of God, taking my curse, would give me his blessing to become a son or daughter of God. That is good news. And you've got to preach it to your heart every day, because the world is going to try to strip you of your joy. They're going to try to give you counterfeit joy. But the only true great joy in life is the goodness of Jesus. And whether gold to you is money, and that's what you're seeking after, that's what's greater than the gospel in your life, is the gold. I've got to have more money. I'll forfeit anything it costs me to. Or for some, especially some of you younger folks, it is achievements. I've got to gain another golden trophy. Listen, I'm going to tell you, the best news that should happen in your house every single day has nothing to do with the stock market, has nothing to do with an academic or athletic achievement. It should be the best news this house is celebrating today is that Jesus is our King. Parents, whatever becomes your celebration is going to become your kids' motivation. If you celebrate their academic and athletic achievements, that is what they're going to go after. We need to be highlighting their character and their morals and their spiritual goals and their spiritual accomplishments far more than anything they could do with the gifts and talents that were given to them by God. Preach the gospel to yourself and prepare the next generation. Value relationships over religion. Again, if I could talk to you moms and dads, just so many young families here. Your children need to see you sacrifice for the kingdom. And they need to see you prioritize Jesus in your family. They need to see you do it. They need to witness your family say no to good things at times in order to say yes to greater things. I witnessed my dad take vacation. He was a construction worker. He got 2 weeks of vacation a year. I watched my dad take vacation time to serve visiting pastors at our church. My mom worked a part-time job 1 day a week. She'd work as a secretary, financial accountant, 1 day a week, and her whole purpose was to save money so that at Christmas time she could bless the Christian school teachers that I had because they were making meager money. She went to work not for our family, not for our betterment, but to be a blessing to the servants of God. I watched my parents give and give quietly and without fanfare. But I saw it. And here's what I knew. Mom and Dad weren't concerned about building an earthly kingdom. They live in the same 1,100 square foot house in Calumet City, Illinois, that they bought almost 70 years ago, where they raised 6 children in an 1,100 square foot home because they weren't trying to build an earthly kingdom. Teach your children, show them what it looks like to love, to serve, and to give generously. And teach them where to find their motivation. It is not from what other people see about you. It is what Jesus knows. When we talk about the next generation, can I always encourage you, as you lead and as you serve, always realize one day I'm going to step down. One day, someone else, I'm going to be too old, or I'm going to be too tired, or the Lord's going to move me to something else. Always be thinking, how can I prepare the next generation? That's what Jesus did. He knew he would have just a short time on earth, and he took fishermen and tradesmen and made them church leaders. If I could also encourage you to encourage those in the trenches, value serving over being served. Can we be honest and transparent? Servants of Jesus can lose their joy at times. It does get hard. It does get weary. It does get heavy. You know what helps? A word of thanks. A note of encouragement. A text that just says, I'm praying for you, thank you, I saw you. We've got to recognize those who are in the trenches doing the work, and we must be encouraging to them. Meaning when you see somebody do something, and I don't mean in this church, I just mean for the Lord. When you see somebody do something, don't pass them up without saying thank you. I don't mean to point you out, Kara, but you're sitting on the front row, and so, here you are, and you give of your talents to help lead our church to have worship. This young lady, by the time she hits the door on Sundays, ought to have a number of people just saying, hey, thanks. And though those who are serving us in different areas here at the church, it ought to not go unnoticed what is done. We're raising a generation of ungrateful, entitled children. I will hold the door open. Everywhere I go, I hold the door open, and I do it on purpose. And when young people walk right past me, I always say, you're welcome. I do it very kindly. I'm not trying to be sarcastic, although I have an intention. I want to teach them, acknowledge somebody. It's not about me, it's about you. Your children shouldn't walk in that back door right there without saying thank you to whoever's holding the door. They shouldn't grab hot chocolate from the cafe without saying thank you to an adult if an adult is back there. They're never going to figure this out on their own, right? We are self-centered, selfish people left to ourselves. If we do not have somebody training us and pointing us to say, that person did something for you, walk over there and tell them thank you. They will not do it. But I will tell you who will be so glad you did this. Their future spouse, their future in-laws, and their future employer. I have two boys that I'm very proud of. Two boys that they were not given the choice. They had to become a servant because everywhere they went, their dad was in charge of something. And so they had to learn to serve. And here's what both of those boys told me. My employers tell me whatever I want to do, they're going to let me do because they know I'll do it right. That is what we're looking for in the next generation. And it can't just be about employers. It's got to be about who the greatest person we're serving is, and that is our King. And if I could encourage you just to discover ways to refuel your heart, to value silence over speaking. When you're losing your joy, what's the song you know to play? What's the scripture you know to go to? Who's the friend that you will turn to for encouragement? Where is the note you keep that inspires you that someone gave you? I promise you this, you're going to go through a difficult time. This month, you're going to hit a low. Sometime this month, you're going to hit a low. What are you going to do when you get there? And we can't ignore our King. We've got to pray. But I'm going to encourage you, when you pray, take more time to listen than to speak. One of the things that I've told a few of our men in leadership that I've struggled with since coming to Plymouth is that I haven't found this place of prayer yet. In Virginia, I used to pray at a mountaintop cemetery. It was called Mount Zion. And one of my favorite things to do was to go there and just one day a week, one morning a week, I would just say to the Lord, what do you want to say to me today? What do you want to say to me? And I would stand there with my eyes open, looking at nature, looking at things around me. I'd look at the birds and I'd look at the clouds. I'd look at everything around me. And I would say, just Lord, what do you want to say to me today? One morning I snapped this picture. The Lord had directed my attention to the fence. Well, Lord, what do you want? What do you want to tell me about this fence? And here's what the Lord said. You see, on the one side is the cemetery. Everything is dead. On the other side, although you can't see in the picture, on the other side were some cows. And there's some cows walking through the pasture. And he said, on the other side is life, and it's not just life, it's life-giving. There's milk and there's meat there. And I walked over to the fence to look at the cows, and I noticed a whole lot of cow piles, cow manure piles there. And immediately, this is what the Lord said to my heart. Where there is life, things get stinky and messy. There's no cow piles in the cemetery because nothing's alive there. But where something is growing, something is living, it gets stinky and messy sometimes. And I needed that moment because I was going through a stinky and messy time. But I was doing it with people who were alive. It's not the only time the Lord used cow poop to teach me a lesson, though. I remember one morning I went and I just put my hands on the fence there, and I stood there, and I was like, Lord, what do you want to say to me today? And I'm not kidding. Like right in front of me was the largest pile of cow poop you've ever seen in your life. It was humongous, and the Lord clearly drew my attention right there. And I literally tried looking at the mountains over here and the hills and the trees and like, Lord, there's got to be something else you want to say to me other than looking at this pile of poop. And no, sure enough, he kept directing my attention there. And I said, okay, well then what do you want to teach me? And I didn't, nothing. I left that time of prayer and I went to meet a fellow pastor for coffee, and I sat down with him, and he was asking about my morning, and I told him, I said, I asked the Lord what he wanted to say to me, and all he did was direct my attention to a pile of cow manure, and I had no idea what he was actually wanting to say to me. And he goes, I have your lesson for you, and I am not making this up. He said, I have your lesson for you, is what he told me. Christians are like cow manure. Pile them together and everything under them dies. But spread them out, and they make everything grow better. I was like, that is awesome. Like, the Lord gave me a picture of a pile of cow manure, but he didn't tell me what it meant. I went to a pastor friend, and he told me. Like, this is amazing. This is what the Lord wants to do. He wants to be an encouragement to your heart. So the next time you spend time in prayer, what if you just spent that time to listen? And this is last. Learn to enjoy Jesus. Value his presence over his presence. This by far is the most important one to me. Learn what it means to live for an audience of one. We get so exhausted when we serve to be noticed by everyone around us. Because what will happen is we will give this huge effort and receive little thanks in return. And that, can I encourage you, those of you teenagers that are here today, before you leave youth group tonight, you need to go see Eric and Liz and Noah and Alicia, who are already preparing and have been preparing for a long time for just tonight. But my guess is, for those of you that have led things, you've put in a huge effort and received very little thanks in return. Can I remind you something? Jesus hasn't missed 1 second of what you have invested. When we read John's Revelation, there's a letter to 7 churches, and into all 7 churches, Jesus says the same thing. I have seen your works. You may not get a pat on the back from any human, but I promise you, your King sees it. And it makes him so happy to see your efforts for his kingdom. I think we should enjoy the gifts, but never at the expense of the giver. When was the last time you talked to Jesus without asking him for something. Because he's not our genie. He's our friend. He's our brother. And he's our king. And he wants his joy to be in you, because one of the warning signs of turning from God is serving without joy. Would you pray with me?